I installed my first bird feeder on a Tuesday morning in March, completely unaware that this simple act would trigger a war with the most vindictive HOA board president I'd ever encounter in Boulder County, Colorado. My name is Aaron Andrews, and I'd moved into the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision 6 months earlier, drawn by the promise of mountain views and the proximity to hiking trails. The neighborhood sat on the edge of Nederland, where the foothills met the Rockies, and wildlife was everywhere. Elk wandered through yards, foxes trotted down streets at dusk, and birds of every variety made their homes in the pine and aspen trees that dotted the landscape. It seemed like the perfect place to indulge my lifelong interest in ornithology. The bird feeders were nothing extravagant. I'd purchased 3 simple tube feeders and 1 platform feeder from the Wild Birds Unlimited store in Boulder. I filled them with black oil sunflower seeds, Niger seed, and a quality mixed blend. Within days, I had mountain chickadees, pygmy nuthatches, Steller's jays, and even a pair of red crossbills visiting regularly. I'd wake up early with my coffee, sit on my back deck, and watch the morning rush hour at the feeders. It was peaceful, meditative even, and it helped me decompress from my job as a software engineer working remotely for a company in Denver. That peace lasted exactly 11 days. I was on a video call when my doorbell rang. Through my office window, I could see a woman in her late 40s standing on my porch, clutching a folder to her chest like it contained nuclear launch codes. Her blonde hair was cut in what I'd learned to recognize as the signature, "I need to speak to the manager" style, and her expression suggested she'd been personally victimized by something I'd done. I muted my microphone and went to the door. "Can I help you?" I asked, opening it halfway. "Are you Aaron Andrews?" Her voice was clipped, efficient, with an undercurrent of barely contained irritation. "That's me. I'm Patricia Davenport, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board. I'm here regarding multiple violations of our community standards." She flipped open her folder and pulled out a printed photograph. It showed my backyard, taken from an angle that suggested she'd been standing in my neighbor's yard. The bird feeders were circled in red marker. I stared at the photo, genuinely confused. "What's the violation?" Section 12. Subsection 4 of the HOA covenants clearly states that no structures shall be erected on the property without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. This includes but is not limited to sheds, gazebos, arbors, and hanging fixtures visible from neighboring properties. She tapped the circled feeders with 1 manicured nail. These were not approved. "They're bird feeders," I said slowly, as if explaining to someone who'd never encountered the concept. "They hang from tree branches." "Irrelevant. They're visible from the street and from neighboring properties. That makes them subject to HOA approval." She pulled out another sheet of paper. "This is your formal notice of violation. You have 72 hours to remove the offending structures. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $50 per day, per structure. That's $200 daily if you're keeping track." I felt heat rising in my chest. "You've got to be kidding me. These are standard bird feeders. Half the neighborhood probably has them." "The other homeowners received approval. You did not." Patricia's smile was thin and cold. "The rules exist for a reason, Mr. Andrews. They maintain property values and community aesthetics. Bird feeders attract vermin, create mess, and can damage trees with the weight of accumulating birds. We've had complaints." "Complaints from who?" "That information is confidential. You have 72 hours. Have a good day." She turned on her heel and walked back to her white Lexus SUV parked in my driveway. I stood there holding the violation notice, watching her drive away. My video call had ended, probably with my coworkers wondering where I'd vanished to. I looked at the paper in my hand. The language was officious and threatening, citing specific sections of the HOA covenants I'd admittedly only skimmed when I bought the house. At the bottom, Patricia's signature was a sharp slash of ink, and the date stamp indicated she'd prepared this notice yesterday, which meant she'd been photographing my yard and preparing violation paperwork almost immediately after I'd installed the feeders. I went back inside and pulled out the massive binder of HOA documents my real estate agent had given me at closing. Section 12, subsection 4 was there, exactly as Patricia had quoted. But as I read further, I found Section 17, which dealt with landscaping and natural features. It mentioned that homeowners were encouraged to maintain wildlife-friendly yards consistent with the natural Colorado ecosystem. That seemed contradictory, but I wasn't a lawyer. I was a guy who liked watching birds while drinking coffee. My first instinct was to just take the feeders down and avoid the hassle. $200 a day was no joke, and I didn't need the stress. But something about Patricia's attitude, that smug certainty that she could dictate what I did on my own property, rankled me deeply. I'd bought this house. I paid my mortgage, my property taxes, and my monthly HOA dues. The bird feeders weren't hurting anyone. I called my neighbor, Greg Thornton, who lived 2 houses down. Greg was in his 60s, retired from teaching, and had lived in Meadowbrook Estates since the subdivision was built 12 years ago. Patricia came by. Greg laughed when I told him about the violation. Yeah, that sounds like her. She's been on a tear lately about community standards. Last month she tried to fine the Johnsons because their garage door was a slightly different shade of beige than approved. The month before that, it was the Petersons' inflatable Christmas decorations. So what do people do? Just give in, most people do. It's easier than fighting. Patricia's got nothing but time on her hands since her husband left her last year, and she runs that board like her personal fiefdom. The other board members are too intimidated to challenge her. Greg paused. But you know, I remember when the Silvermans tried to fight a violation about their solar panels a few years back. They ended up having to hire a lawyer. Cost them thousands, even though they eventually won. That wasn't encouraging. So I'm supposed to either cave or spend a fortune on legal fees over bird feeders. Pretty much. Welcome to HOA living. It's like high school with property deeds. After I hung up with Greg, I spent the evening researching Colorado HOA law. The state had specific statutes governing homeowner associations, and there were limitations on what HOAs could enforce. But the legal language was dense, and I couldn't determine if my bird feeders fell into any protected category. The next morning, I woke up to find another notice on my door. This one informed me that the 72-hour clock had officially started at midnight, and I now had 60 hours remaining to comply. Patricia had apparently driven by my house after I'd gone to bed to deliver it personally. That's when I decided I needed help beyond Google searches and conversations with neighbors. I drove down to the Boulder County offices and asked about wildlife regulations. The clerk directed me to the Colorado Parks and Wildlife building on Pearl Street. Inside, I explained my situation to a receptionist who looked maybe 25 and seemed more interested in her phone than my bird feeder crisis. "You'll want to talk to Officer Linda Hernandez," she said, finally looking up. "She handles wildlife conflicts and community issues. She's actually in the building right now if you want to wait." I waited in a small conference room for about 20 minutes before Officer Hernandez arrived. She was in her early 40s, wearing the standard Colorado Parks and Wildlife uniform, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She shook my hand with a firm grip and sat down across from me with a notepad. "So tell me what's going on," she said. I laid out the whole story, showing her the violation notices and the photographs Patricia had taken. Officer Hernandez listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes. When I finished, she sat back and tapped her pen against the notepad. "Okay, here's the thing," she said. "Colorado has specific protections for wildlife feeding activities, particularly in areas designated as wildlife corridors or habitats. The foothills area where your neighborhood sits is classified as critical habitat for multiple species, including several that are monitored by our department. So bird feeders are protected. It's more nuanced than that. The Colorado Revised Statutes, specifically Title 33, deals with parks and wildlife. There are provisions that prohibit local ordinances or private covenants from unreasonably restricting activities that support wildlife conservation and observation. Bird feeding, when done responsibly, falls under that umbrella." She flipped through a small handbook she'd pulled from her pocket. "Your HOA can have rules about aesthetics and placement, but they can't prohibit bird feeders entirely, and they can't impose unreasonable restrictions that effectively prevent you from maintaining them." My heart rate picked up. "So I can tell them to back off. It's not quite that simple. What I can do is provide you with official documentation that explains the state's position on wildlife feeding. I can also note in our system that you're engaged in legitimate wildlife observation and conservation activity. If your HOA continues to pursue fines, you'd have legal grounds to challenge them based on state law superseding HOA covenants." She started writing on an official form. "I'm also going to schedule a site visit to your property. I'll document the types of birds using your feeders and assess whether your setup is appropriate for the area. When can you do that?" "How about tomorrow morning? Say 9 o'clock. I agreed immediately, feeling like I'd finally found an ally in this absurd situation. Officer Hernandez spent another 15 minutes explaining proper bird feeding practices, the importance of keeping feeders clean to prevent disease, and the types of seed that were best for Colorado's native bird species. She seemed genuinely passionate about her work, and I found myself relaxing for the first time since Patricia had shown up at my door. That evening, I drafted a polite email to Patricia and the HOA board. I explained that I'd consulted with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and that my bird feeders were part of a protected wildlife observation activity. I attached a PDF of the relevant statutes that Officer Hernandez had sent me. I kept the tone professional and respectful, hoping that presenting the legal information would resolve the matter without further conflict. Patricia's response arrived in my inbox at 6:30 the next morning. The subject line was "Violation Notice Status," unchanged. The email was 3 paragraphs of thinly veiled hostility. She dismissed the wildlife statutes as irrelevant, claimed that I was misinterpreting the law, and reiterated that HOA covenants were legally binding contracts that superseded my personal preferences. She also noted that I now had less than 48 hours to comply before fines would begin accruing. I forwarded the email to Officer Hernandez with a note asking if she'd still be able to do the site visit. She confirmed she'd be there at 9. Officer Hernandez arrived exactly on time, driving a white CPW truck with the department logo on the side. She spent nearly an hour in my backyard, photographing the feeders, documenting the bird species that visited. We saw chickadees, nuthatches, juncos, a hairy woodpecker, and a mountain bluebird during her visit, and taking notes about the placement and maintenance of the setup. "This is excellent," she said. crouching to examine some spilled seed beneath one feeder. "You're keeping the area clean. The feeders are properly spaced to prevent overcrowding, and you're using quality seed that benefits native species. This is exactly the kind of responsible wildlife stewardship we encourage." She took photos of my entire backyard, including the surrounding trees and the natural habitat that bordered the subdivision. "Your property backs up to open space that's part of the Roosevelt National Forest Corridor. This area is crucial for bird migration and year-round habitat. What you're doing here supports that ecosystem." As we walked back around to the front of the house, a white Lexus SUV pulled up to the curb. Patricia got out, her expression shifting from smug satisfaction to confusion when she saw Officer Hernandez's uniform and vehicle. "What's going on here?" Patricia demanded, striding across my lawn. Officer Hernandez turned, her demeanor professional but firm. "I'm conducting a wildlife habitat assessment. And you are." "I'm Patricia Davenport, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. This homeowner is in violation of our community covenants." "I'm aware of the situation. I'm Officer Linda Hernandez with Colorado Parks and Wildlife." She pulled out one of her business cards and handed it to Patricia. "Mr. Andrews contacted our office regarding his bird feeding activities. After conducting a site assessment, I've determined that he's engaged in legitimate wildlife observation and habitat support that's consistent with Colorado state regulations and conservation goals." Patricia's face flushed. "The HOA has rules about structures on properties. Those rules are legally binding. HOA covenants can't supersede state law," Officer Hernandez said calmly. "Colorado Revised Statutes Title 33 provides protections for wildlife observation and conservation activities. Mr. Andrews' bird feeders fall under that protection. I'll be filing a formal report documenting this assessment, and I'm informing you now that any attempt to fine or penalize Mr. Andrews for maintaining these feeders would be contrary to state wildlife regulations." "That's absurd. We have the right to maintain community standards." "You have the right to enforce reasonable aesthetic standards," Officer Hernandez corrected. "You don't have the right to prohibit activities that are protected by state law. If you'd like clarification, I can provide you with contact information for our legal department." Patricia snatched the business card and glared at both of us. "This isn't over. The board will be consulting with our attorney." She turned and marched back to her SUV, driving away with more speed than was necessary for a residential street. Officer Hernandez watched her go, then turned to me. "That's going to be a problem." "What do you mean?" "She's not going to let this go. People like that, when they feel their authority is challenged, they double down." She handed me a folder containing her assessment report, photographs, and copies of the relevant statutes. "Keep this documentation safe. If she tries to impose fines, you'll need it. I'd also recommend documenting everything, every interaction, every notice she sends you. If this escalates, you might need to consult with an attorney who specializes in HOA law." I thanked her, feeling both relieved and anxious. The relief came from having official backing from a state wildlife officer. The anxiety came from Patricia's parting words and the certainty that she wasn't the type to admit defeat gracefully. The next day was Sunday, the deadline Patricia had imposed. I spent the morning at the feeders as usual, watching a pair of pine siskins work over the Niger seed feeder. At noon, my doorbell rang. It wasn't Patricia this time. It was a thin man in his 50s wearing khakis and a polo shirt with Meadowbrook Estates HOA embroidered on the chest. He introduced himself as Dale Morrison, the HOA's compliance inspector. "I'm here to verify the status of the violation," he said, consulting a tablet. The deadline for compliance was noon today. The feeders are staying up, I said. I've been cleared by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. The feeders are protected under state wildlife conservation regulations. Dale looked uncomfortable. Sir, I'm just doing my job. The board has instructed me to document the violation status. I can see the feeders are still present, so I'll need to note that as continued non-compliance. Did Patricia tell you about the wildlife officer's assessment? She mentioned something about that. But the board has decided to proceed with enforcement pending review by our attorney. He tapped something on his tablet. You'll be receiving notification of the fine assessment within 24 hours. You have the right to appeal to the board at the next meeting, which is scheduled for next Thursday evening. After Dale left, I called my parents in Fort Collins. My dad had dealt with an HOA dispute years ago at their previous home, and I hoped he'd have advice. He listened to my explanation and then sighed deeply. HOAs can be nightmares, son. We ended up selling our place and moving specifically to get away from ours. But if you've got state law on your side, that's huge. You just need to be prepared for a fight. I don't want to fight. I just want to have bird feeders in my own yard. I know, but that woman sounds like the type who makes it personal. Document everything, like that wildlife officer said, and maybe find a lawyer who'll at least consult with you about your options. That evening, I searched for attorneys specializing in HOA law in the Boulder area. Most of the firms wanted retainers of several $1,000s, which seemed insane for a dispute over bird feeders. I finally found a solo practitioner named Robert Chen who offered a 1-hour consultation for $200. I booked an appointment for Tuesday. Monday morning brought the promised fine notice. It was delivered via certified mail, requiring my signature. The document assessed fines of $200 per day starting from the previous Sunday noon deadline, with daily accrual continuing until compliance was achieved. It included a statement that the fines would be added to my HOA account, and that failure to pay could result in a lien being placed on my property. That escalation made my stomach drop. A lien could affect my ability to refinance or sell the house. This wasn't just an annoying neighbor dispute anymore. It was potentially serious. I scanned the fine notice and emailed it to Officer Hernandez, asking if she had any additional guidance. She replied within an hour, suggesting I contact the county's code enforcement office and possibly file a complaint with the Colorado HOA Information Office, a state resource created to help homeowners navigate disputes. My consultation with Robert Chen happened Tuesday afternoon at his small office in downtown Boulder. He was younger than I expected, probably in his mid-30s, with an easy manner that put me at ease. I walked him through the entire situation, showing him all the documentation I'd collected. He reviewed everything carefully, occasionally making notes on his laptop. When he finished, he looked up with a slight smile. "This is actually pretty straightforward from a legal perspective," he said. "The HOA is clearly overreaching. Colorado law is explicit about wildlife conservation activities being protected from local restriction. The fact that you have a state wildlife officer's formal assessment and documentation makes your position very strong. So what do I do? First, draft a formal response to the fine notice citing the state statutes and the wildlife officer's report. I can help you with the language. Make it clear that you're not paying the fines and that you consider them invalid based on state law. Second, attend that board meeting on Thursday and present your case. The board is required to allow homeowners to speak about violations during meetings. Third, if they don't back down, file a complaint with the state HOA office and consider a declaratory judgment action in county court. What's that? It's a legal proceeding where you ask a judge to declare that the HOA's enforcement action is invalid. It's faster and cheaper than a full lawsuit. Given the strength of your position, I'd estimate you'd win, and you might be able to recover attorney fees. How much would that cost? If it goes to court, you're looking at maybe $3,000 to $5,000 in legal fees. But honestly, I don't think it'll get that far. Once the HOA's attorney reviews the wildlife statutes and the CPW report, they'll probably advise the board to drop it. Most HOA attorneys are risk-averse because they know how expensive litigation can be for the association. That gave me hope. Robert helped me draft a formal response letter to the HOA, citing specific statutes and making it clear I wouldn't be paying the fines. I left his office feeling like I finally had a game plan. Wednesday afternoon, I received an email from someone named Ellen Kirkwood, another member of the HOA board. Her message was apologetic and tentative. She wrote that she'd heard about the dispute and wanted me to know that not all board members agreed with Patricia's approach. She suggested I make sure to attend the Thursday meeting and present my evidence to the full board, as decisions required a majority vote. That was encouraging. Maybe Patricia didn't have the support she thought she did. Thursday evening, I walked into the Meadowbrook Estates community clubhouse, carrying a folder stuffed with documentation. The meeting room was set up with a table at the front for the board members and rows of chairs for homeowners. About 20 people were scattered through the seats, probably there for various agenda items. The board table had 5 chairs. Patricia sat in the center, with Dale Morrison to her right and 3 other people I recognized vaguely from neighborhood events. Ellen Kirkwood, a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and a kind face, was on the far left. Next to her was Marcus Webb, a black man in his 40s who I knew worked in real estate. On Patricia's other side was Sheila Crawford, a nervous-looking woman who kept checking her phone. Patricia called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock sharp, running through standard procedural items. There was a discussion about landscaping budgets, an argument about the pool schedule for the upcoming summer, and a presentation about updating the playground equipment. Finally, after 45 minutes, she reached the point on the agenda labeled Violation Enforcement Matters. "We have several open violations to discuss," Patricia began. "First is the matter of 2315 Pinewood Drive, homeowner Aaron Andrews. Mr. Andrews installed multiple unauthorized structures without Architectural Review Committee approval. He has been notified of the violation and assessed appropriate fines. Mr. Andrews, I see you're here. Would you like to address the board?" I stood up and walked to the front, my folder in hand. "Yes, thank you. I think there's been a misunderstanding about the so-called violation. The structures in question are bird feeders and they're protected under Colorado wildlife conservation statutes." Patricia's expression didn't change. "The covenants require approval for all structures. Whether they're protected by some other regulation is irrelevant to the HOA's rules. Actually, it is relevant." I opened my folder and pulled out Officer Hernandez's report. "I contacted Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and they conducted a formal site assessment. Their finding is that my bird feeding activities constitute legitimate wildlife observation and habitat support protected by state law. Colorado revised statutes explicitly prevent HOAs from prohibiting or unreasonably restricting such activities." I handed copies of the report to each board member. Ellen and Marcus immediately began reading. Sheila glanced at hers nervously. Dale looked confused. "Furthermore," I continued, "I've consulted with an attorney who specializes in HOA law. His opinion is that the fines you've assessed are invalid and unenforceable. I'm not paying them, and I'm formally requesting that the board rescind both the violation notice and the fines." Ellen looked up from the report. "Patricia, did you know about this wildlife officer's assessment?" "The officer came to his property, yes, but that doesn't change the fact that he violated our covenants." "It actually does," Marcus interjected, still reading the report. "If state law protects this activity, our covenants can't supersede that. We could be opening the association up to liability if we try to enforce this." Patricia's jaw tightened. "The rules exist for a reason. The rules have to be legal," Ellen said firmly. "Mr. Andrews, thank you for bringing this documentation. I move that we rescind the violation notice and dismiss the assessed fines." "I second," Marcus said immediately. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. "We haven't heard from our attorney on this matter." "Then we should table any enforcement action until we do," Ellen said. "But in the meantime, we shouldn't be assessing daily fines when there's a clear question about our legal authority to enforce this." Dale looked at Patricia, then at Ellen, clearly unsure whose lead to follow. Sheila continued staring at her phone. "All in favor of rescinding the violation and fines?" Ellen asked. She and Marcus raised their hands. Dale hesitated, then slowly raised his. Sheila looked up, confused. "What are we voting on?" she asked. "Dismissing Mr. Andrews' violation and fines," Ellen repeated. "Oh, sure." Sheila raised her hand. Patricia remained motionless, her hand firmly on the table. "This is noted as 4 in favor, 1 opposed. The motion carries." Her voice was ice. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Thank you. I appreciate the board taking the time to review this properly." As I returned to my seat, I caught Patricia staring at me with undisguised hostility. The meeting continued with other business, but I barely heard it. I'd won. The violation was dismissed, the fines were gone, and I could keep my bird feeders. After the meeting, Ellen approached me as people filed out. "I'm sorry you had to deal with this," she said quietly. "Patricia has been increasingly difficult over the past year. Some of us on the board have been concerned about her approach, but she's very forceful. I appreciate you and Marcus backing me up in there. It was the right thing to do. And honestly, that wildlife officer's report made it clear we didn't have a leg to stand on. I'm going to suggest to the other board members that we review our covenants with an attorney to identify other areas where we might be overstepping state or federal law." I thanked her again and headed out to my car. As I walked across the parking lot, I heard rapid footsteps behind me. "This isn't over." I turned to find Patricia standing a few feet away, her arms crossed. "The board voted," I said. "It's over. You think you're clever, finding some loophole with wildlife regulations, but there are other ways to maintain community standards. I'll be watching your property very carefully from now on. Every blade of grass too long, every trash can left out too late, every tiny violation, and you'll be hearing from me." That sounds like harassment. That sounds like enforcement of our community rules. You wanted to play hardball, Mr. Andrews. Congratulations, you won this round. But you're going to discover that living in this neighborhood is much less pleasant when you don't have the HOA's goodwill. She walked away before I could respond. I stood there in the parking lot, feeling my relief evaporate. She was right that technically she could make my life miserable with aggressive enforcement of every minor rule. I'd won the battle over the bird feeders, but I'd made an enemy who had both the motivation and the authority to retaliate. Over the next 2 weeks, I discovered exactly how petty Patricia could be. I received violation notices for my trash cans being visible from the street 15 minutes after collection time. The rule said cans had to be removed from the curb by end of business day. I received a notice for a small oil stain on my driveway that she claimed was a hazard. I received a notice for my grass being 3.5 inches tall. The maximum was 3 inches, though I'm still not sure how she measured it. Each notice came with a warning that failure to comply within a specified time frame would result in fines. I meticulously documented each notice, photographing the supposed violations and the timestamps. The trash can violation was particularly absurd, as the photo sheet included showed the empty cans sitting at my curb at 2:15 in the afternoon. The covenant specified end of business day, which any reasonable person would interpret as 5 or 6 o'clock at minimum. I consulted with Robert Chen again, this time over the phone. He advised me to compile all the violation notices and file a harassment complaint with the state HOA office. He also suggested I wasn't the only homeowner likely experiencing this treatment, and that I should consider talking to neighbors about organizing a recall of Patricia from the board. The idea of organizing a political campaign within my HOA was exhausting, but I started reaching out to neighbors. Greg Thornton wasn't surprised when I described what was happening. She did the same thing to the Robertsons when they fought her about their front door color. Eventually, they just repainted it to her preferred shade because it was easier than dealing with constant harassment. But Greg also mentioned that several homeowners were increasingly frustrated with Patricia's authoritarian approach. He suggested I talk to Jennifer and Mark Phillips, who lived on Aspen Court. They'd apparently had multiple run-ins with Patricia over various issues. I visited the Phillips on a Saturday afternoon. Jennifer answered the door with a cautious expression that turned to sympathy when I introduced myself and explained why I was there. "Oh God, the bird feeder guy," she said. Come in, come in. Mark, it's the bird feeder guy." Mark appeared from the kitchen, and we sat in their living room while I recounted the whole saga. They listened with increasing animation, interrupting occasionally with their own stories of Patricia's overreach. "She tried to fine us because our mailbox post was quote-unquote structurally questionable," Jennifer said. "It was a tiny crack in the wood. We offered to fix it, but she wanted us to replace the entire mailbox setup with a specific model she approved of. The cost difference was $300 versus $1,200. What did you do? We replaced the post for $300 and told her if she wanted something else, she could pay for it herself. She backed down that time, but she's been on our case about other things ever since. Last month it was our Christmas lights coming down too slowly after the holidays." Mark leaned forward. "Here's the thing. Patricia's made enemies all over this neighborhood. I'd say at least half the homeowners can't stand her. But she's got this core group of supporters, older residents mostly, who like her strict enforcement because they think it protects property values. And she controls the board through intimidation and manipulation." "Ellen and Marcus seem reasonable," I said. "They are, but they're not willing to really stand up to her. Thursday's vote was the first time I've heard of them directly contradicting her on anything. Usually they just go along to avoid the drama." Jennifer pulled out her phone. "There's actually a private Facebook group for residents who have had issues with the HOA. It's called Meadowbrook Estates Homeowner Support. About 40 people are in it. You should join." She sent me an invite link, and I joined the group right there from my phone. The recent posts were a litany of complaints about aggressive enforcement, unreasonable fines, and Patricia's hostile attitude toward anyone who questioned her authority. Several posts mentioned specific incidents that sounded legally questionable. One homeowner, Susan Montgomery, had been fined for having a vegetable garden in her backyard that was supposedly visible from the street. Another, Tim Barrett, had been threatened with a lien for unpaid fines related to his garage door being left open during daytime hours, which Patricia claimed was unsightly. "Has anyone tried to recall her from the board?" I asked. Mark and Jennifer exchanged glances. "There's been talk," Mark said, "but it's complicated. The HOA bylaws require a petition signed by 20% of homeowners and then a special election. Patricia's fought every attempt at recall by intimidating people or claiming procedural errors with the petitions. But if enough people are fed up, maybe now's the time to try again," Jennifer suggested. "Especially with your bird feeder case showing that she's willing to violate state law to push her agenda." We talked for another hour, strategizing about how to organize a recall effort. The Meadowbrook Estates subdivision had 187 homes, which meant we'd need at least 38 signatures to trigger a recall election. Given the Facebook group had 40 members, that seemed achievable. Over the next week, I threw myself into what felt like an absurd political campaign. Jennifer created a petition document that cited specific instances of Patricia's overreach and called for her removal from the board. We printed copies and started going door to door in the neighborhood. The responses were mixed but generally supportive. Many homeowners were afraid to sign, worried about retaliation. Some didn't want to get involved in neighborhood politics. But a surprising number eagerly signed, often launching into their own stories of Patricia's unreasonable enforcement tactics. Mrs. Henderson on Oakwood Lane had been fined for having a wreath on her door that exceeded the approved decoration size limits. The Chens on Birchwood Court had been threatened with fines for their son's basketball hoop, which Patricia claimed was an unapproved structure. The Johnsons on Meadow Drive had been harassed about their choice of mulch color in their flower beds. By the end of the week, we had 52 signatures, well over the required threshold. I compiled the petition along with a cover letter explaining the grounds for recall and delivered it to Dale Morrison as the HOA's compliance inspector and secretary to the board. Dale looked uncomfortable when I handed him the thick envelope. "This is going to cause a huge fight." "The bylaws are clear about the process," I said. "We have more than enough signatures. A recall election has to be scheduled. I'll present it to the board at the next meeting. But Aaron, be prepared. Patricia is going to come after everyone involved in this." He was right, of course. Within 24 hours of the petition being submitted, I received a new violation notice. This one claimed that my bird feeders were creating excessive noise due to bird activity, and that neighbors had complained about being disturbed early in the morning. It was such obvious retaliation that it would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. I documented the notice, added it to my growing file, and called Officer Hernandez at Colorado Parks and Wildlife. "She's still harassing you." Linda sounded genuinely annoyed. "Okay, at this point I think we need to escalate this. I'm going to have our legal department send a formal letter to your HOA board. This is starting to look like targeted harassment intended to prevent legitimate wildlife conservation activity, and that's something we take seriously." Would your department really get involved in an HOA dispute? When the HOA is clearly violating state wildlife regulations and harassing someone for engaging in protected activities? Yes. We don't do it often, but we have the authority to enforce compliance with state conservation laws. She